Hi, folks. My name is Jeff Cox, and I'm an engineering director at Google. I'm really pleased to welcome Jim Salzman and Michael Heller to Google to talk with us about their new book, Mine: How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. By way of introduction, Michael Heller is one of the world's leading authorities on ownership, on who gets what and why. He is a chair professor and a vice dean at Columbia Law School. His teaching and writing helps people see and cure ownership dilemmas no one has previously noticed. Jim Salzman is one of the world's leading environmental theorists. He is a distinguished professor at UCLA Law School and the UCSB School of the Environment. His broad-ranging scholarship addresses topics ranging from water to wildlife, from climate change to creating markets for ecosystems. Welcome to have them both here. We're going to start with a presentation that they're going to give, and then we'll do Q&A at the end. Feel free to submit questions that you have for either of them through YouTube Live. With this, I'm going to hand it off to Michael and Jim.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff. You can hear me? All good? All good. So it is such a treat to be able to share our ideas with you today. And we're going to start with a saga. So the saga is going to be we're going to start this saga at the airport. That's a place you may remember. Many of us have not visited for a while. And as in many sagas, we have a hero and we have a villain. And the vessel they're traveling on is this United jet. And we're not going to tell you who the villain is and who the hero is. This is James Beach. He's a big guy, over 6 feet tall. He's a frequent business traveler. On a crowded United flight from Newark to Denver, he hit a middle seat, row 12. He gets on the flight. After takeoff, he lowers his tray table, takes out his laptop. He also takes out his knee defender. And before he starts to type, he puts this knee defender on. You can see the knee defender circled here in red. This is a little plastic clamp that attaches to the front of the tray table. You can see them here. And just $21 on the internet. They, in fact, defend your knees. They lock the front seat in place. The slogan for the website is, the knee defender will stop reclining seats on an airplane so your knees won't have to. Beach, assured of his workspace, opens his laptop. He starts typing. The claims for the knee defender are real. The passenger sitting in front, she cannot recline her seat. She quickly realizes what the problem is. She tries to get Beach to remove the knee defenders. Whether he's going to or not, we don't know. He doesn't take them out quickly enough. So she jams her seat back. The knee defenders pop out, that jolts the laptop into Beach's chest. He jams the seat back up, reattaches the clamps. At this point, she turns around and throws her cup of water at Beach. We'll never know how this might have escalated even further, because the pilot at this point ordered an emergency landing. They land in Chicago. Both players are escorted from the plane, presumably somewhat abashed. The plane continues to Denver, an hour 36 minutes late. The key point, though, is the high altitude brawl went viral. Now, fights over reclining seats may seem foolish and maybe even a little stupid, but they reveal a great deal about how the hidden rules of ownership work. And we're going to ask 3 questions to frame the first half of our talk today. Why is reclining an ownership conflict? Why are these battles breaking out now? And as we started with, who's the villain here and who's the hero? So let's start with the first question. So why is reclining an ownership issue at all, right? What's ownership got to do with this? Well, the fight may seem to be whether you can recline or not, but there's more going on. The real conflict here is control over that yellow wedge of space behind the seat. Does it belong to the recliner in front or to the knee defender in back? Now, once you think about it, conflicts like this actually occur in other parts of flying. So you know what happens when you get in the middle seat with a shared armrest. This is sort of unspoken jostling. This is a clever entrepreneurial solution to that. I've actually never seen it, but you can see how it might solve the problem. But the same thing's going on with overhead baggage space, with the window shade, whether it goes up or down. Every inch on board is contested, and even more so today with concerns over social distancing and COVID. This is true not just on airplanes. Ownership invisibly shapes every day of our lives. This is what our book is about, every minute. These are the rules that decide who gets what and why. Our stuff is always contested. This determines whether you stand at the front of the line or the back, where you live, the medications you take, where you drive. Hundreds of times a day, we encounter conflicts over who gets what. And most of this, almost all of it, is decided outside the law. The law is highly overrated. We tell our law students that. They don't believe it, but it's true. We'll get to this, I'm sure, more in the Q&A. These conflicts are decided by a small handful of ownership stories. This is true all over the world. It always has been. It always will be. Our drive to own is hardwired, and it goes way back in evolutionary history, and not just for humans. All species compete for the control of scarce, valuable resources. So it's springtime, summer now. You may be walking around and hear this wonderful bird calls, and you think, how pleasant, how bucolic, what wonderful chirping. I suspect you might think differently if you heard what the birds actually are saying. Often birds mark their territory and basically say, don't even think about crossing this line. And we humans, we're no different. You spend some time in a playground, and I promise you, you're going to hear kids shouting one word. And you know what that word is. That word is mine. 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 Every language, all over the world. Mine is one of the first words that kids speak. As I said, every culture around the world. And this word only grows in importance as we grow older. Now think about all the sayings we have about ownership, right? If we were in class right now, I'd ask for volunteers and such, and you come up, I think, with a dozen or more. You can read on the screen yourself. Here are 6 that we're going to return to and point later. But there are a lot of sayings about ownership, and that's not by coincidence. We learned these sayings from a very early age. They become so ingrained we don't even realize it. It's like a fish that doesn't realize it's swimming in water. And just to kind of drive this point home, think about the creation legends of Western civilization. Let's start with Greek mythology. So what is the catalyst for the birth of civilization? It is Prometheus who steals fire from the gods on Mount Olympus. He takes what is not his. He pays a terrible price for that. His liver is torn out every day by an eagle. It's really sort of a gothic version of the movie Groundhog Day. Actually, Groundhog Day meets birds. But the point here is that human ownership of fire sparks civilization. Same basic idea going on with the creation myth of the Judeo-Christian religions. So the Garden of Eden, right, in the Bible, it's based on ownership. God basically says, you've got the run of the place, but you see that tree over there and that fruit? Do not take the fruit. It's not yours. Adam and Eve can't resist. They pluck the apple. Human history begins. But it's not just that, right? After Adam and Eve take the fruit, trespassing now exists too. The Archangel Michael stands outside the garden with a flaming sword. This isn't just a question of changing the locks. This is no longer your place. They leave, and mine has remained up for grabs ever since. So why does ownership feature so centrally in these creation myths? Well, in our book, Michael and I argue that human society exists to help us deal with competing claims to ownership. Might be food, might be water, might be sexual partners, might be territory. But we need these rules so we don't kill each other too often. So let's now turn back to the first question. Why is reclining an ownership conflict? Why is it an ownership issue? Well, the fact is it's an ownership issue because it's scarce and people want it. And ownership is up for grabs everywhere and always when more than one person wants the same thing. Michael, let me pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jim. And for those of you listening, we're going to take questions at the end of the talk, so you can put them in the comments or in the live chat in the YouTube. So let's go to our second question, which is, why are these battles breaking out now? Why are seat recline battles leading to planes being grounded? This didn't used to happen. Planes weren't making emergency landings over these kinds of fights. No one thought to ask who controlled that wedge of space, that orange, the yellow wedge, because there was plenty of space. But that's not true anymore. Today, the tray table space has become much more valuable for our laptops. People have gotten larger. But the crucial piece is that airlines have been shrinking the pitch. That's the distance between seats. Not that long ago, it was 35 inches between seats. Now the pitch is down to just 28 inches on some planes. Each time the airline saves an inch of pitch, that lets them sell 6 more seats on that flight. It adds up to a whole new row of seats. So what airlines are doing is they're squeezing more passengers inside that same fixed steel tube. And as our personal space shrinks, that wedge becomes ever more valuable. We passengers get angrier at each other because most of us assume that the wedge of space is up for grabs, that it's available for either passenger to claim in front or in back. It's ambiguity about who controls the wedge that turns out to be the key to solving this ownership puzzle. The ambiguity is not an accident. Airlines actually do have a rule. You have a right to recline, but they never announce the rule and they rarely enforce it. And why is that? The answer is that airlines are masters of ownership engineering. Those inches of space, that is their core product. And they engineer those inches using what Jim and I call deliberate ambiguity. Deliberate ambiguity is an advanced tool of ownership design. When ownership is ambiguous, airlines know that people mostly fall back on politeness and good manners, not law and rules. We all try to work it out between ourselves. So while we're doing that, airlines are profiting. What deliberate ambiguity lets the airlines do is sell that wedge of space twice on every seat, on every flight. Once for you to recline, and again for my knees and my laptop. And even better, that is for the airlines, is that this conflict they've created in economy class, that's what creates the market for higher spaced seats up front. So the answer to our second question, why are these battles breaking out now? It's because airlines are using an advanced tool of ownership design to profit from the conflict they've created. And it's for that reason that airlines actually have banned knee defenders. They need to preserve that ambiguity. And that's what actually brings us to our third question. Who's the villain and who's the hero in this seat recline story? So to answer this, we actually need to expand our cast of characters beyond James here in the picture. Some of you may recall this image. This is from a video that went viral about a year ago. That's Wendy Williams in front in the red sweater. She's just reclined her seat. You can see the guy behind her. He's in the last row, so he can't lean back, and Wendy's pretty much in his lap. So he gets mad, and he's banging the back of her seat like an irritating metronome. She's holding up her cell phone to film this video. Millions of people watched this confrontation. So who's the jerk? Who's in the right? Is it the recliner in front, Wendy in this case, or the guy in back, say James? So I want to ask you all who are listening today, maybe just to pause for a second and think about, what your reaction is when you fly. Is it okay to recline your airplane seat on a crowded flight if someone is just behind you? So maybe your answer is, yeah, like if it can recline, I'm reclining. Or maybe your answer is no, just don't do it. Now, if it were possible to poll you all today, however many of you are listening, I would report at this moment the poll. And here's what would blow your minds. Whatever your answer is, reclining is wrong or reclining is right, about half of this audience would take each position. Jim and I have asked this question for many, many different audiences, and it always splits 50-50. So half of you would support Wendy, like the Ellen DeGeneres headline up there. She was behind Wendy. Ellen DeGeneres said, listen, unless the seat punches you, don't punch back. Half of you listening today would support the guy in back. That's actually the position that Delta CEO Ed Bastian took about this Wendy Williams video. He was saying that Wendy should have asked before leaning back. So universally, you're probably pretty sure about your own view. But I hope and I expect maybe some of you at least who are listening today, maybe some of you are surprised how much of the audience here today, people in your life, disagree with you. So if you're a lean back person, they take the no lean position or the other way around. How is that possible that the views split right down the middle? And here's the answer. What's going on is that mine may seem obvious and natural to each of us. But this ownership conflict, like every ownership conflict, is actually a storytelling battle. And what's remarkable is that when things first come to be owned, that battle always draws from just 6 very simple competing stories. So if you're with Wendy, if you're saying, I can lean back, you're asserting what Jim and I call the attachment story. It's mine because it's attached to something mine. So you're saying, well, that little button on the seat, that's what controls the wedge of space. And it's the exact same debate when you buy a piece of land. When you buy a piece of land, you just get a deed, which is a sheet of paper. So the attachment principle is what determines whether you own oil or water below your land, or present conflicts today over air above your land. Can a neighbor fly a drone over your backyard? Can a neighbor block your solar panels? Who gets these new resources like droneways and wind for windmills? So attachment turns out to be the most important ownership principle that most people have never heard of. It dates back thousands of years. It's what underlies the principle, my home is my castle. Attachment turns out to be the most important tool that we have to stop or slow climate change. For those of you who voted with James Beach, the guy in back with the knee defenders, you're telling a different story. You're telling the possession story. Possession is 9/10 of the law. It's mine because I am holding onto it. Possession is just as fundamental as attachment. Possession traces back to our territorial animal instincts, to those birds and dogs. So James is saying, my knees, my laptop, they hold the space. It is mine. So when that seat reclines, it feels like a trespass. That in the slide there is actually Jim on his most recent flight, when that's his computer squished up there in the picture. Anyway, attachment and possession, those are two of just 6 basic stories we all use to claim everything in the world. Everything. The third story is first in time. First come, first served. It's mine because I got it first. We used first in time all the time. This is how kids line up for the playground swing. This is how countries claim space for geosynchronous satellites when they put them up in orbit. Fourth story is labor. It's mine because I worked for it. This story also goes back to the Bible. You reap what you sow. Reward for labor. This is the intuition behind all IP, all intellectual property. It's why we grant patents to inventors and copyrights to artists. Fifth story, self-ownership. It's mine because it comes from my body. Our bodies, ourselves. This is the ownership story that's at stake when we fight, for example, over the question, should we be able to sell our kidneys to people in need? Or should college athletes be able to profit from their celebrity? The sixth and final story is family. It's mine because I'm in the family. We may say, the meek shall inherit the earth, but the reality of family ownership is far more troubling. We now live in a country in America with extraordinarily generous rules for the super rich and a different, much harsher set for the rest of us. Everything you own, everything you want, traces back to some original somebody who is asserting one of these 6 stories. And conflicts arise when you assert one story and I reply with another. We each claim the moral high ground. We each insist on the rightness of our story, the story that advances our view. And here's the cool thing. That reclining seat battle with those competing stories, this is not just about the trivial airplane wedge. This plays out across the entire economy and with far higher stakes. And with that, let me throw it back to Jim.
Thanks. So check this out. I mean, more and more, we live our lives online. And our internet activities, they reveal what we buy, where we travel, even our health status. And I'm sure, as the folks in this audience know, these data are known as clickstreams. So this explains why, let's say you think, maybe I want to go to Chicago for the weekend. So you go on Kayak or Orbitz or some other site, and you check out flights. And all of a sudden, no matter where you go across the web, you're followed, right, by all these ads that pop up talking about Chicago hotel deals, plays in Chicago, restaurants in Chicago. What's happened is that the website, the travel website, tracked my activity, and it sold this to advertisers. Our click streams, our likes, our looks, these are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. They power much of the internet economy. Now, what's interesting about this, and particularly for this audience, this is generally framed as a privacy issue. But in our view, it actually turns on ownership. And it's one of the central questions for our time. So when we give this talk, we poll audiences and we ask, should Amazon, should Facebook own the click streams for people who are using their websites? And I want you to think for a moment how you would answer. And the answers are actually quite interesting. We'll get into this in the Q&A afterwards. But not only would I like you to think about how you would vote, but what do you think the polling generally shows? If the reclining was 50-50, what do you think populations think when we ask them who should own their click streams? The key issue here is the battle is playing out right now, and it's typical of a much broader dynamic. So whenever any new valuable resource emerges, ownership is ambiguous at first. No one knows who owns it because no one thought about it before. And what's happened here is the web companies, they've staked their claim. The settings could not be more different, but here's the thing that's so cool. The same stories are at play in seat reclining and online. Amazon, Facebook, they are telling an attachment story. Their data trackers are like the button on the airplane seat. Our clickstream data attaches to their apps. The Facebook and Amazon are also using the labor story. We spent a lot of time, put a lot of effort into building these super cool apps. We've earned the right to click streams that are left behind. But people can push back and they can claim possession. The trackers are trespassing into their lives. It's possession versus attachment all over again. So metaphorically, Facebook and Amazon are essentially leaning their data trackers into our virtual apps. And the key question for our time is, can we create virtual knee defenders to keep them out? Europe and California have started giving people some control over their data privacy, but in most of America, most of the world, ownership remains up in the air. And so the first step in claiming people's click streams is to realize that all of us right now, we are in the middle of a storytelling battle for the fate of our online lives. We think about this as privacy. It's very much ownership as well. So what lessons then can we take from the saga of the reclining airline seats or the click streams and such? Number one, ownership conflicts are all around us. Whenever people want the same stuff, there's an ownership battle, and that is everywhere, and that is always. As resources become scarcer, the stakes rise in the storytelling battle. And as Michael talked about, we just use 6 simple stories, and this is true in every corner of the world. Now, you may have noticed we are using Western examples, and certainly different cultures will emphasize one story over another. Some societies are more communal. Some are more focused on private property. But the point is that everyone is choosing from the same 6 stories. They're all using the same storybook. And finally, and most important, ownership is up for grabs. It is always a choice. There is never a necessary correct answer for who gets what. And this is, in a sense, the biggest shock that our law students get. They think there's just a rule for everything and that's it. That's not the case, right? Property is always up for grabs. And to show you that more concretely, we're now going to pivot. In the remainder of the talk, we're going to open a window into how the hidden rules of ownership really work. So let's go back to some of our basic sayings we talked about earlier. My home is my castle. Possession's 9/10 of the law. First come, first served. These stories are so powerful because they feel natural. They feel fair. They feel simple. But much of what we know about these stories, much of what we assume about these stories, it's wrong. In practice, more and more often, the real ownership story is my home is not my castle. Possession is 1/10 of the law. And lastly, what we're going to talk about next, first come, last served. Savvy businesses, governments, they already understand this. They are skilled at engineering the 6 simple stories of ownership to steer you to do what they want. So again, to see how this works, we're going to focus today on first come, first served. And Michael's going to start by explaining that.
Thanks so much, Jim. So first come, first served. This has been the rule for how people initially claim mine for most of human history. This is true today. You go to the deli to get a bagel, it's first in line, step on up. Or you go to the DMV to get your driver's license. This is also actually how water rights are divvied up in the American West. We use a rule called prior appropriation. So the first to put the water to beneficial use owns the water. They are first in right. This is how family wealth has been passed down for most of human history. Inheritance went to the firstborn son. That's why Jacob is tricking Isaac in this picture here. He's tricking his blind father so he can claim his older son his older brother Esau's inheritance. Kids are taught from a very early age to line up, to be first, to get all sorts of things. And you can see why this ownership story is so powerful. It's intuitive. It feels fair. It's often easy to apply and enforce, even for kids, without a lot of parental policing. But here's the thing. Who is first does not define itself, not ever. This is something that we really struggle to drill into our law students. That first in time is not an empirical fact. It never is. Who is first, what acts count to make you first, is always a story. It is always a choice, and it is always up for grabs. So to show you how this actually works, I want to take us for a few minutes to the world masters of first in time, of line management, and that's Disney. So Disney markets itself as the most magical place on earth. 58 million visitors a year, America's top honeymoon destination. Do you know one place where Disney is not the most magical place on earth? It's when you're waiting 5 hours for a 5-minute ride on Space Mountain. Forget about it. Even when you get inside the ride, there's another long wait. So kids are not known for their patience. First in time created a real headache for Disney. The long lines were annoying too many customers, and Disney couldn't engineer the rides to accommodate more people per hour. So here's the challenge that Disney faced. Could they engineer ownership instead? Could they profit from the long lines? And what they did is they introduced something called a fast pass. And that lets families skip the regular line for a fixed entrance time later in the day with a very short wait or no wait at all. So those who plan ahead can use up to 3 of these fast passes per day. So for kids who want to take the Seven Dwarfs train, they're not so grumpy anymore. They're happy instead. It's basically win-win. And in particular, Disney wins. With Fast Pass, Disney gets those grumpy families moving around, spending money, not angrily waiting in line. So this is no longer old-fashioned first in time, but this particular change, the Fast Pass, feels pretty open and accessible. Everyone can get a Fast Pass if they plan ahead. So the question for Disney was, could they do even better? Could they profit directly from the line waiting hassle the company created? Here's where Disney took the next step, what Jim and I view as the genius step in ownership design. There are a lot of wealthy people who have more money than time. And for them, Disney created something called the private VIP tour. It's like a super duper fast pass. It lets you skip every line on every ride all day long for just $3,000 to $5,000. So if your family wants to ride Splash Mountain 5 times in a row with no waiting, knock yourselves out. So now Disney profits from the long lines it has created. It's the same as the airlines creating a market for business class by ensuring misery in economy. But there's a catch for Disney. So if Disney visibly moves too many families to the front, they risk really angering the many grumpy families who are still patiently waiting in line. So what Disney does is they assign a guide to discreetly help each group of very wealthy families, to discreetly help them cut the lines. So for some rides, what the guides do is they bring the families in through a side door or through the exit. And that's actually what's happening in this slide here. For Disney, old-fashioned first in time left too much money and on the table, created too much frustration. So it changed who counts as first, starting with the Fast Pass and then with the VIP tours. So the families that are patiently waiting in line still, they can't tell that anything is amiss. They never realize that the real rule has become first come, last served. So with that, let me kick it back to Jim.
Right. So realize what's going on here. Disney is using ownership like a remote control. They're steering us to do what they want. right? So Disney redefines first twice. The Fast Pass steers families to spend money on Mickey merchandise and those giant turkey legs, rather than simply idling in line. The VIP Pass steers the one percenters to pay thousands. The low value customers, not low value like low esteem, but the ones who aren't paying as much, they're left waiting these endless lines. And in fact, they're the only ones who are still playing by the old story of first come, first served. Ownership works as social engineering. The owners of scarce resources that people want, they design allocation, they design how you get these resources, and they use that to basically steer us to do what they want. So wherever you see long lines, there's an insight here. And that is that creative entrepreneurs, not just the owners, the creative entrepreneurs, they can profit by re-engineering first also. So here's a great example. So the Supreme Court, this is a view, as many of you may know, this is a view of the inside of the US Supreme Court. This offers arguably the best free show in DC. You literally sit just steps away from the justices. There are only about 100 free seats on these benches in the slide, and they're available for the public, first come, first serve. That is a scarce resource. There's no cutting, right? People line up well ahead for the big cases. But here's what gets interesting. Minutes before the doors open, a very strange thing occurs. The sort of raggedy looking people at the front of the line, they exchange places with well-dressed folks who are carrying briefcases. So what's going on here? Welcome to the line standing industry. So linestanding.com and others, they charge clients up to $6,000 to get in first. The business model, pay a minimum wage to hired line standers who will wait for days in the rain and the cold. This is now a standard expense for lawyers and lobbyists. If you go to DC and you want to see a big Supreme Court argument, the odds are you can't get in. So again, normally if we were doing this on Zoom, we'd basically ask you in a poll, how do you react to paid line standing? So ask yourself for a moment, does this rub you the wrong way? Is it undemocratic? Is it unfair? Maybe it's a great thing. Maybe this is the market at its best. It is clever people creating jobs to meet demand. And so the question is, do you think it's okay to pay someone to hold your spot or not? And what's fascinating is that when we poll audiences, the answers vary quite a bit. So we gave this talk to my students. I teach at law school, but also at the School of the Environment at UCSB. And about 2/3 of the students did not like line standing. We also gave the talk at Columbia Law School to Michael's law students. Exact opposite. 2/3 of them thought it was a great idea, right? So this obviously, how we think about this in terms of democratic accountability or accessibility, in terms of entrepreneurial opportunities, this varies on who you are. There isn't a right or wrong answer here. There's no law on lines. However you answer, though, this is the key point. The shift to first come, last served. Not first come, first served. First come, last served isn't about the money. There are also democratic values are at stake. And the old-fashioned first in time, it rewarded those with the spare time needed to get there first. First come, last served, by contrast, that rewards wealth. This favors those who can pay for the time of others. And quietly, across the economy, owners are rewriting the first in time story. From time to money, from equality to privilege, from first to last. We see this with congestion pricing on the highways, with who gets to board first with flights, all kinds of examples. So next time you're waiting in a long line, ask yourself, are those ahead of you being paid to wait? And what does that mean for you as a consumer? What does that mean for you as a citizen? Now, we showed you this slide earlier in the talk. One kid is shouting, mine, I'm holding on to it. The other is screaming, no, mine, I had it first. So one thing that we want you to realize this far into the talk, this isn't just screaming kids saying mine, 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 mine. They're telling very concrete, credible, sincere, earnest stories. Possession, first in time. So this isn't just a screaming match. They're using just 2 of the 6 simple stories everyone uses to claim everything. And you also know that remarkably, businesses and governments are using the exact same stories. It's not on the playground, but it's the same stories. They're using these to decide who can recline, who owns your click streams, and who gets vaccines first, right? Think about COVID vaccines. Who gets them first? Those were also storytelling battles as well. Who should get to the front of the line? It's not just those. It's for hundreds of other ownership conflicts around us. And in all of these cases, ownership is being used as a form of social engineering. In the talk today, we focus on the shift from first come, first served to first come, last served. But savvy owners are skilled at turning all 6 ownership stories on their head to get what they want without us really realizing that anything has changed. And believe me, the change is fundamental. Michael, you want to bring us home?
Thanks so much, Jim. So I want to leave you all with 4 parting puzzles to sort of ponder, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, which is our favorite part. Anyway, once you know where to look, the hidden rules of ownership explain a lot of puzzles, and they are all around us all day long. The Starbucks line. How is that organized? So here are a few from the book that we want to just raise for you now. Why, for example, is it that HBO tolerates illegal password sharing? When we poll our law students, all of them are illegally sharing passwords. HBO knows this. HBO can find them and doesn't. And the answer turns out to be that tolerating theft is another advanced strategy of ownership design, just like strategic ambiguity with airplane seats. HBO tolerates, it actually encourages illegal password sharing as a way to build its customer acquisition pipeline. Why is it how is it that Amazon's little shopping cart and that buy now button, how does that make you overpay for downloads? And here's the answer to that. Amazon has been really savvy about redefining online possession. So we think of possession as 9/10 of the law. Online, they've been able to redefine it down to about 1/10 of the law. Amazon and Apple can and have actually deleted downloaded books and movies right off of people's devices. They can't come into your apartment to do that, but they can take them off your device. And what that means is that today, there's a growing gap between what you feel like you own online and what you actually own. And that means that online retailers gain an unearned premium, an extra profit, every time you download a book or a movie. Here's the third puzzle. How is it that South Dakota has become the world's leading money haven? If you're super rich listening today, you already know this. But today, South Dakota is actually crushing Switzerland and the Cayman Islands for the world's super wealth. So one deviant state on its own is turbocharging America's new aristocracy of inherited wealth. It's what keeps the rich rich. So I guess the question for you all is, what can the rest of us do about this parallel and actually substantially hidden legal system for the super wealthy? And here's a fourth puzzle. Why is it that New York City has some of the world's best drinking water? It routinely wins blind taste tests against all of the priciest bottled waters. And the answer is that governments are sometimes turning the 6 ownership stories upside down, not necessarily for profit, but to serve the common good. So New York uses ownership design, purely ownership design, not billion-dollar treatment plants to keep the city's water clean. New York City is the largest untreated water supply system in the country. So it's all about ownership. Actually, our best solutions for protecting natural resources like fisheries, for solving climate change, for keeping New York City water clean, they all involve redesigning ownership, and in particular, redesigning the attachment story. So those 4 puzzles and 100 more may seem on their face to be unrelated, but they all snap into focus as soon as you look at them through the lens of ownership. So I want to leave you with a challenge. If you pick a newspaper any day, the day you're listening today, I am 100% confident that there will be a front page story that turns on the hidden rules of ownership and that snaps into focus once you see how they work. And how can I be so sure? Because the 6 simple stories that we explored today, they frame every struggle over the things we all want. And that turns out to be a lot of things. Once you see how ownership really works, you cannot unsee it. And once you can see it, you, each of you, can begin to be a more effective advocate for change as a parent, as a consumer, and as a citizen. And if it's okay for just a minute, I want to indulge in a little bit of self-promotion, and then we'll wrap us up for questions. So Jim and I wrote this book in particular for readers of books like Freakonomics and Tipping Point and Nudge. It is just cool, fun stories that will change how you see the world. So the book makes a really fun gift. It's a great summer beach read. That was our plan for writing the book, was have it there for the summer. We have a website, which I'll put back up in a minute. This is the front of the website. It's mindthebook.com. We have put a ton of free resources up there. We want you to take advantage of them, please. There's book excerpts. For example, the New York City water story is up there for free. The airplane story is up there. We have short videos on a bunch of the stories we couldn't include in detail today, like South Dakota. There's a really fun quiz that was in Worth magazine about ownership and sort of what you know and don't know. You can take the quiz. That's up there. Discussion questions, if you have a book group, that's also up there. Also a way to contact us. Jim and I love talking about this stuff. We love it. So if you have an audience that wants to hear about this, please get in touch with us. Anyway, however you do so, we really hope that you make Mine yours. So it's mindthebook.com. Tons of resources up there. A lot of press clippings as well. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us here today. And with that, we wrap up the presentation. And now let's go to Q&A.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. The book it was definitely excellent and goes into a lot of additional examples that really motivate and provided sort of the context for giving these lessons. I watched an interview on YouTube that you did earlier this year where you mentioned that folks were actually auditioning ownership examples for the book, some of which obviously made the book, but I was sort of curious to know if there were kind of outtakes or additional ones that were worth highlighting but didn't make it into the book itself.
Oh yeah, I mean, there were a ton of examples we couldn't include because we basically were using examples that we thought would sort of get the point across. We didn't want to have multiple examples. My favorite is something called spite fences, S-P-I-T-E. And it turns out, I'll bet a lot of folks listening to this have had some kind of experience with neighbors that was not entirely positive. And this happens a lot. And so a spite fence basically is where one neighbor is angry at another, and so they raise a fence on their own property to basically spite their neighbors. So there's sort of two ways to do this. One way is if you're trying to block your neighbor's view of a vista. And so my favorite was a neighbor who built a very high fence and put it on rollers. They basically could roll it wherever his neighbors were to try to block their view in real time. The other favorite of mine that I wanted to include, but we didn't, was a farming example where two neighbors didn't get along, and so one basically painted on the back of their barn that faced their neighbors this giant hand with a middle finger raised toward their neighbor. It turns out, if you're interested, if the folks who are watching, if you Google spite fence, you'll see some of these examples and many others. A lot of creativity.
No, I bet that makes a ton of sense. I'm sure you are getting new examples that maybe you'll feed into an upcoming sequel or something like that. So,
yeah, mine too.
Mine too. So one more question for me, and then I'll pivot over to some of the audience questions. Given the digital asset ownership issues you raised in Chapter 7 and mentioned here around Amazon and Apple, and also Google, I believe was in that chapter as well. I'm curious to know your thoughts on non-fungible tokens or NFTs and whether they have a role to play in addressing these ownership issues of digital assets.
Sure. So Jeff, what NFTs are, for your listeners who aren't aware, is so Bitcoin is a fungible token. One Bitcoin is like $1 bill. You can just trade it for any other identical Bitcoin. A non-fungible token marks a specific thing. So we saw, for example, non-fungible tokens being issued as a way to authenticate a particular piece of digital art. So there was a $69 million sale by an artist named Beeple that was authenticated by an NFT. The reason that you have NFTs authenticating digital art is that digital art is perfectly copyable down to the pixel. So there's no original of a piece of digital art. Everyone is exactly the same as every other one. So how do you speculate? How do you create like financial markets in digital art if it's such a democratic medium? So NFTs are a way to basically financialize digital art, to basically a way to bring money into that world. So I tend to be, Jim and I have done a lot of interviews about NFTs and crypto, and we tend to be real skeptics about this. I view NFTs as sort of combining in one package the worst of art and the worst of blockchain to the detriment of both. So they're enormously energy intensive. They waste a tremendous amount of energy. The amount of energy going into blockchain is more than many countries use altogether. And they do it in the service of taking what has been one of our most democratic media of art, which is the perfect replicability of online art, something that really was very widely shared, and making it a sort of a plaything for techno-savvy guys in their basement who were, I think, had a lot of time and money on their hands during the pandemic. So I actually think that the NFTs are going to be are a bit of a Ponzi scheme. So I'm a skeptic. I wouldn't invest there. I'll be a little more sanguine about them in a time when we start to see real secondary markets, resales of NFTs, which doesn't really exist yet. You need to see that to have some sense that there's some stability in this market, and I'm skeptical that that will emerge. I may be proven wrong, but I wouldn't put my money there today.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for the comprehensive answer. Why don't we pivot over and take a few audience questions? Let's see. So Sandeep Giri asks, what is the optimal methodology to value and share our environment? Oceans, mountain ranges, rivers, biodiversity of flora, fauna, or clean air? How do we fairly penalize pollution of these resources?
Yeah, so that's a profound question. I mean, some of you may be wondering, because I'm an environmental guy, right? What's an environmental law person doing writing a book on ownership? And it turns out that many of our most difficult environmental problems are because of poor ownership design. So a factory owner, all right, so she pollutes. She has effluent that goes out and pollutes the rivers. She has air pollution that goes out. She owns that in essence until she pollutes, and then she doesn't own it anymore. The public owns it. Thank you very much, right? It's a negative externality for the economists that are out there. And so one of the challenges in environmental law and policy is how do you create what can effectively be called as if ownership, right? So how can you link the bads that people produce back to them, but also how can you link the goods? So the New York City story that Michael was talking about, what was going on was that New York City has terrific drinking water because the water doesn't come from New York City, right? It comes from over 100 miles away in the Catskills and the Delaware watersheds. And they have these massive pipes that actually for over a century now, they've used to pipe the water down to New York City. In the 1980s, there was a problem. The water was getting more polluted because there was development going on and the owners of the watershed lands were using their lands differently. But from the owner's perspective, why shouldn't they, right? They're producing clean water, but they don't own it, right? There's no incentive for them. And so what New York City did essentially is to say, we're going to treat you as if you own the clean water you're producing for us. And so we'll pay you essentially for that. Now let's pivot to climate change, right? One of the biggest drivers of climate change is deforestation. It's because both trees suck in carbon dioxide out of the air. And when you burn trees, it releases carbon dioxide and you've lost the sink. It's like kind of a double whammy. The question, though, is from the forest owner, why should they keep the trees standing? If they can do slash and burn agriculture or something else, you use as if ownership. You basically say to them, look, we're going to create incentives so that the trees are worth more standing than cut down. And it's a policy called RED. Norway's behind it. It's a very, very active area in international climate negotiations right now. And as Sandeep said, it's all about ownership, either ownership of goods or ownership of bads. That was just the whole of environmental law in 90 seconds.
I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that, but that was a great answer. All right, let's do another audience question. All right, so Andrew Smith asks, does your work have anything to say about land ownership or particularly Georgism, the view that land should be public property?
We don't have a bottom line. I spent actually many years working in post-socialist countries. So I was always part of the first team into a country after the communists fell. I was working this was many years ago. I was working for the World Bank back then. My job was to define and design property rights in land and housing in many different countries around the world, Russia, Hungary, Poland, a bunch of them. And the challenge there was always to think about how do you create private property regimes that would sort of serve the goals that people had there to have a little more control over their lives than socialist or public ownership allowed. That's not exactly what the questioner is asking. But what we see around the world is actually quite a wide range of land ownership regimes. So for example, Hong Kong actually has a quite vibrant real estate market, and all that land is public land. All the buildings on it are actually very, very long-term leases. You have some of those very long-term leaseholds in the US in places like New Haven. You have 900-year leases. So you can have very vibrant market economies. And we see them across the world based either on public or on private underlying ownership. And with long enough term leases, the public and private actually have an identical economic effect. So I'm agnostic as to public versus private as a sort of root of ownership in a legal system. I tend to, what I care about more are the consequences and the sort of the rules for how that ownership is structured. So, and in particular for land, what are the rules for attachment? So 100 years ago, for example, when people first had air flights, there's this old principle that when you own land, you own up to heaven and down to hell. So people started suing airlines for flying 10,000 feet above, saying, hey, you're trespassing in my column of space. So it's, and very early on, courts in America, actually around the world, said, no, we're not going to, that far up is not attached to your land. Above 500 feet is not attached. So that doesn't matter whether the underlying land is public or private. You still have to answer the question, can you exclude an airplane or not? The question today is, can you exclude a drone flying at 200 or 300 feet or not? That's still a question that's very much up in the air. It's a new resource, like the wedge of space on the airplane seat or the clickstream. Anytime there's a new resource, how much is attached to land is up in the air, is contested. And that's very much true for every aspect of land up and also below ground for drinking water, below ground for aquifers, for oil, for minerals, and also in from the sides. So it's those specific questions that I think are really what we should be focusing on when we talk about land ownership in America.
It's almost like there's this whole set of questions around even defining the scope of what land is. That's sort of what you're getting at.
Yeah, people say, my home is my castle. And it turns out that that's, not true. So that the chapter in the book where we talk about land is titled, My Home is Not My Castle. And we show all the very many ways, surprising ways, that sort of intuition that we have, that feeling it's mine, really doesn't correspond very well to what it is that we buy when we buy land.
That makes sense. All right, let's do another audience question. Okay, Yisha Oyang asks, how do you think ownership in space will play out? The Outer Space Treaty prohibits nations claiming sovereignty over any celestial body, but allows for commercialization of space resources.
So there's a treaty that governs the moon. When the U.S. went and landed on the moon, and Neil Armstrong planted the flag, you have that iconic image in your mind. That planting the flag is traditionally how countries claimed territory. When explorers planted flags, and they may have been Native Americans there, but the flag is what counted for ownership in the European legal system of the day. Anyway, so the U.S., actually the Congress, passed a law in 1969, just before the U.S. landed, saying this flag is not establishing a U.S. ownership claim over the moon. We're bringing that flag is actually claiming it for humanity as a whole. So that was one specific instance of how you sort of think about ownership in the extraterrestrially. But this is coming out more and more with commercializing asteroids, with people going to the moon to bring back resources from the moon or using moon resources as bases for further space exploration. And this is absolutely up for grabs in exactly the same way that any resource is when it's first coming into ownership. Our genetic data when you send it into 23andMe, when you swab and you send it in, who owns that gene sequence? Your clickstream, who owns that? That wedge of space, the land above your house? It is the exact same debate on who owns resources in outer space. And it's the same 6 stories. First, possession, eventually attachment. It's attached to our base, labor. All those stories are going to be recapitulated in outer space. And we have, at this point, except for the Moon Treaty, we have essentially no international legal treaty governing what is essentially a Wild West, but instead of west, it's up and out.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. All right, we only have a few more minutes, so let me just close with a couple other questions for you both. So since you mentioned Google specifically in your book, as well as other tech companies, what would you like to see our company, Google, and other tech companies do to address the issues of ownership, fairness, and equality that you highlight in your book?
Well, you've already done the first step, which is to have us here today, and we're so grateful for the opportunity. And actually, what I hope more people at Google do is read the book and sort of think about sort of what Google itself can do to be more responsive to the kinds of ownership concerns that we raise about fairness and inequality. Jim mentioned earlier in the talk that we usually poll audiences at various points in the talk. It's a great way to engage an audience. Like, sort of, what do you think? And then realizing how people are different. Anyway, one of the things we usually ask people is, should you own your clickstreams? And usually about 80% of people say, yeah, I should own my clickstream. And about 20% say, no, this is the price I pay for these great free products. So I guess one thing I'd like to see Google think about some more is ways to make it more transparent who owns our online data, and think about ways that that we could actually monetize and pay people for the data that is sort of the raw material that powers the internet economy, Google in particular. I actually think that it would be better for Google in the long run. I think it's actually as a market case for Google to sort of reconceptualize clickstream data as something that they pay consumers for transparently, rather than sort of as this implicit deal for having the free service. I think you would get higher quality data, having people opt in if they could actually get paid for the several $100 value that each consumer today produces in clickstream data online.
Yeah, it's definitely not the area of Google that I work on, but I'm happy to help make some introductions to sort of prompts.
Jim and I are always available. We love to talk about this stuff.
All right, let me close with kind of a personal question for you both. As co-authors of a novel you spent many years working on, how do you think about ownership of your book itself? Do you see it as a creation that you collectively share, or are there parts of it that you each feel more individual ownership of or attachment to?
It's a great question that all authors have to face. I mean, the traditional co-authored book, the authors basically just slice up the chapters. So you do 2, 4, 8. I'll do 1, 3, 5, 7. We didn't do it that way. We basically brainstormed over every chapter and sent literally hundreds of drafts back and forth. And so when I read through the book or when I listen to it on audio, I can catch phrases that Michael wrote. I can catch phrases that I wrote, but 90% of the book, I don't know who wrote it, which is great. I mean, one of the joys of the book is I'm more an environmental guy. Michael's more sort of property development person. And the fusing of those two together, I think, has led to something that's much better than either of us could have done on our own. And, Google, I know, is all about teams. And so I'm preaching the converted, but it certainly worked for us.
And I believe you're talking about me writing another book called Ours, and so this would be more of an example of, of that.
Yeah. That is the sequel. We're debating Mine 2 or Ours.
I like Ours better personally.
All right, you guys should. That's great. That's great.
we need the voting mechanism. All right. Well, I think we're out of time. Thanks so much for coming again. The book is called Mine. It's available for sale in both physical and digital formats. Thanks again, Michael Heller and Jim Salzman, for spending the time with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks
so much
Jeff.
fun. Thank you so much.